Hello, everyone. This is the 284th episode of Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and a Soccer Nostalgia blog. For this episode, I welcome back English podcasters from the 1865 Nottingham Forest podcast, Mr. Stephen Toplis and Mr. Jeremy Davies, as we discuss Nottingham Forest in the decade of the 1980s. Welcome back to both of you.
Thank you.
Hi,
Pleasure to be here.
good to be back.
Last time, Stephen, we discussed Nottingham Forest in the 1980 Champions Cup. So now this is a continuation of the trajectory into the decade of the 1980s. What was the state of the affairs at Nottingham Forest in the summer of 1980 following two consecutive Champions Cup victories?
Well, off the back of the second European Cup winner, things were very healthy. Forest back-to-back European Cup winners and having achieved on top of the league win in 78 and the European Cup win in 79 to then go and defend the trophy in Madrid against Hamburg was a phenomenal achievement, particularly when Forest, for a variety of different reasons, weren't fancied in that final. So, yeah, Forest were in a very, certainly on the pitch, in a very strong position. But I think as we'll get into 1980-81, you start to see a lot of changes at the club in terms of play personnel, and I think Brian Clough and Peter Taylor begin to move out some of those European Cup winners and try and freshen up the team. In doing so, it perhaps doesn't work quite as successfully as things had done in the years running up to that.
I'd say there was also an awareness that the club needed to build on the success. Quite literally, they needed bigger attendances, possibly a bigger ground, and that to compete with, they weren't really, the term super clubs wasn't really a thing at that stage, but to compete with Liverpool on a longer term, there needed to be squad reinforcements, there needed to be more investment, there needed to be larger attendances. So I think there was an air of change and an air of needing to look to the future. I also think that despite the ongoing success, everything was on a knife edge because the tempestuousness of the relationships that Clough in particular, Brian Clough, maintained with his senior players, and how he got the peak performance from them was to keep them on their toes. But for example, in the wake of the 1980 Cup final, players that had been left out of the squad were, those relationships had broken down, left out of the squad for the final. And so I think there was a perception that the team needed refreshing.
Nevertheless, I imagine at this point, as far as the fans are concerned, Brian Clough could do no wrong. Can you paint a picture of his status at this point?
Well, he was more than he transcended football. His fame went beyond Nottingham, went beyond the game. He was a regular on TV, a media personality. In terms of how he was perceived within Nottingham, yes, certainly. I mean, his autobiography is called Walking on Water for a reason.
Based on what you've been saying, even before this 1980-81 season started, was there a feeling that perhaps this Nottingham Forest had reached its limit? And was there belief that the magic would not continue?
I think there was a perception that the team needed refreshing. I don't necessarily think there was a belief that the magic wouldn't continue, because Clough and Taylor had this managerial alchemy and ability to extract the maximum from players. So I think the belief at the time was very much that they would continue to work that magic of their own. There were certainly tensions, there were injuries. Trevor Francis, who obviously had won the first European, had scored the winning goal in the first European Cup, was injured. Archie Gemmill was frozen out at the club and looking to move on. Viv Anderson picked up an injury. So a lot of the key players were starting to show signs of wear and tear, having been, many of them, ever present or almost so for those tremendously successful couple of years. So I think there was certainly an air of confidence, Whether there was a belief that it would continue, as I said, everything was on a knife edge because that was the way that Brian Clough liked to keep things. There were tensions internally emerging in those relationships, which may not have been particularly well known to the public. But as I said, Clough was such a massive presence in the club, in the city, in the game, and in the country that I don't think you could separate the status of the club from the status of the man.
Stephen, what was the backbone of the familiar faces at this point?
So all of the key players from the European Cup wins are there. So Peter Shilton is in goal. Larry Lloyd, Kenny Burns are there. All the key midfielders, including John Robertson, obviously, and John McGovern, Ian Bowyer. Trevor Francis, as Jeremy says, although there were injury concerns with him, Gary Birtles is still at the club. The key players who've won those trophies for Forest are still there, but I think at this point, a few of them are approaching 30, some probably just the wrong side of 30. So that is probably what was working Brian Clough and Peter Taylor's thinking, that they need to move some of these players on and maybe refresh the squad and try and go again with a new crop of players. And when you start to look at some of the transfer activity this season, I think that's where most of that transfer thinking comes from. The big signing really is Ian Wallace from Coventry City. He joins for £1 million. Well, it's 1,250,000. He was a player who'd been Coventry's top scorer for the previous 3 seasons, formed a really good partnership with Mick Ferguson there. I wouldn't say he was prolific. He was more of a guy who would get you between 13 and 15 goals a season. I think he did hit 20 at Coventry once, but he comes in for a big fee. And around this time as well, Forest having broken the transfer fee for Trevor Francis over £1 million, they start to spend millions a bit more frequently in this period, as we'll go on to see.
The other key signing was Raymond de Ponte, who was from Grasshoppers, who'd done well against the Forest in the European Cup. And I think that showed a trend that was to continue, which is Clough and Taylor signing players that had done well against the club, which is a well-trodden path, and certainly one that Sir Alex Ferguson was to mimic in his time at Manchester United. But it's fair to say, as Stephen said, that the shelling out large fees for these players didn't generate the returns or the rewards that previous transfer outlays had done.
The transfer activity for this 1980-81 season is not as impressive. I mean, you mentioned Ian Wallace, Raymond de Ponte, Peter Ward from Brighton arrives later in October, and later in the season you have the Norwegian Einar As from Bayern Munich. But you have members of the Champions Cup winning side leaving the club. I think John O'Hare had retired by now. Larry Lloyd leaves in March. He joins Wigan. Ian Bowyer left in January, joining Sunderland. Martin O'Neill, he left in February, joining Norwich City. Gary Birtles in October, he joins Manchester United. All these players are slowly leaving the club and maybe not being replaced in terms of quality. The club would finish 7th for the 1980-81 season. That's a season with Aston Villa winning the title, and failed to make an impact in Europe. They were eliminated in the first round by the Bulgarian club CSKA Sofia. They lost in the European Super Cup to Valencia. And also, they played the Intercontinental Cup in February and they lost to Nacional Montevideo. Was this a season where there was an indication that maybe Forest era was over, perhaps?
I think at the time, I don't think it was seen like that quite so much, because there was an interview done with Brian Clough after the defeat to Sofia in the European Cup, and I think he's asked the question, "Is this the end of an era?" And he doesn't believe that it is.
A guy called Maurice Edwards, who was someone who did a lot of scouting for Clough and Taylor, wrote a book in which he refers to serious concern. This is in 80-81, that the glory period, as he refers to it, was coming to an end and replacements were needed. So there was clearly an awareness internally at the club. There was a need to freshen up the team. And he describes the 80-81 season. Final league position was a disappointing 7th with no trophies to be added. So again, clearly there was an awareness that it was a transitional period and it was time to look to the future. and refers to the departures of people like Martin O'Neill and Ian Bowyer as real significant departures in terms of the playing staff and the need to fill the holes they left. The other significant thing is that there were younger players coming through, and the story of that, the Miracle Men, the 1978-79 team, was that in addition to the likes of Trevor Francis that were brought in for big fees, players that were there when Clough arrived, like obviously Martin O'Neill and particularly John Robertson, went on to way exceed expectations and the performances that he was able to coax out of them. So the fact that he was promoting younger players at the same time as bringing in some signings showed that there was strength within the club and a desire to maintain that thread of local heroes and local roots that had run through the initial squad. So in that 80-81 season, Gary Mills, who had played in the Champions Cup final, Colin Walsh, Stuart Gray were coming through, as well as these expensive new signings. So there was definitely a wind of change blowing through the club and the playing staff.
For the 1981-82 season, we have the departures of Trevor Francis to Manchester City. Frank Gray joins Leeds. Raimundo Ponte, he joins French side Bastia. Later, we have Kenny Burns also joining Leeds. As far as the arrivals, we have Justin Fashanu from Norwich, Mark Proctor from Middlesbrough, Peter Davenport coming from Camelaird, and later we have the West German Jürgen Robber from Bayern Munich, as well as Ian Bower returning from Sunderland in January. Scottish defender Willie Young from Arsenal also joining in November. And we should mention during that season, I believe Steve Hodge would make his debut for the side. Nottingham Forest are without European football for the first time in a few years. They finished mid-table. They finished 12th. As you see, Brian Clough is again offloading some of the bigger names. How was this activity viewed as it paid no dividends?
I think this was a continuation of, if you want to call it a decline, the decline that had started the season before. Because, Forest finished 12th in the league in 81-82. It's the worst league placing since they were promoted under Clough and Taylor. And signings such as Justin Fashanu, he's held up as the big signing that showed that Forest were on the wane, because they had paid another £1 million for him and he didn't really deliver. I think he'd been bought off the back of a fantastic goal that he'd scored against Liverpool for Norwich in 1980, which won Match of the Day's goal of the season. A fantastic swiveled volley from outside the box, which really was a remarkable goal, but he never really looked like producing his best form in a Forest shirt. I think he had personal problems as well, which in later years were very well documented. Perhaps Brian Clough wasn't the most sympathetic to those problems at the time. Again, it was a very different era, and I don't think the knowledge or the safeguarding was around in those days for people like Justin Fashanu. So he never produced anywhere near his best form in a Forest shirt, and his signing was also a factor in Peter Taylor's decision to retire at the end of the 81-82 season, because he felt that he'd lost his touch and that he needed to take a break from the game. And he arranged with Brian Clough that he would retire in the summer of 82 and Clough would stay on as Forest manager and Taylor would go into retirement. So, when you look at all those factors, a few of the players you mentioned as well there never really made much of an impact. Jürgen Rober, for example, another signing from overseas that didn't do a great deal. And there were a few names in there. Mark Proctor, who was around at Forest for a couple of years, probably never hit the heights of predecessors such as Martin O'Neill. Another example of where Forest's transfer policy is a little all over the place around this time is that Ian Bowyer comes back from Sunderland, and Brian Clough, in doing that, basically admits he regrets selling him in the first place. So I think they were trying to do a lot to move the team on from 1980, but in doing so, probably did it a bit too quick and let some of those players leave while they still had plenty to offer at Forest.
For the 1982-83 season, there are some new efficient signings. As far as the departures, though, you have Peter Shilton leaving and joining Southampton, Dave Needham joining the Toronto Blizzard, John McGovern joined Bolton Wanderers, Jurgen Robber returned to West Germany to Bayer Leverkusen, Gary Mills joined Seattle Sounders, Neil Ledford also joined Bolton, Justin Fashanu joined Notts County. Einar Aas, the Norwegian, he joined Norwegian side Moss. But as far as the arrivals, we have the Dutch goalkeeper Hans van Breukelen, who'd be European champion in 1988, later starred with PSV Eindhoven. He came over from Utrecht. You have Gary Birtles returning from Manchester United. You have Kenny Swain joining from Aston Villa. Colin Todd joining from Birmingham City, Danny Wilson arriving in January from Chesterfield. There would be an improvement as Nottingham Forest finished in the fifth place and qualified to Europe again. Was there a belief at this point that perhaps a new cycle may begin?
Yeah, certainly if you look at the writings at the time, there was a belief that things were settling down. And again, perhaps not the expectation that they would get back to, the club would get back to the heights that they'd scaled previously. But Maurice Edwards, for example, writes that the much changed first 11 were settling in. Interesting, you mentioned the arrival of Colin Todd, and Stephen referred to the return of Ian Bowyer, which Colin Todd had been with Clough in his Derby days, and they'd achieved great success together. But it does speak to the fact that he was aware that experience was needed to work with the younger players and the new signings. The departure of Shilton, I mean, it's inconceivable these days, I think, that England's goalkeeper, recognised as one of the best in the world, would be allowed to leave and would go to a club like Southampton, with no disrespect. But in fact, you mentioned Hans van Breukelen. Initially, Shilton's place was taken by Steve Sutton, a young player coming through. And once again, to step into those shoes suggests that there was still a level of the Cloughy magic, the Cloughy confidence in promoting youth and making players play above themselves. But again, an awareness with the arrival of Van Breukelen that experience was needed to sustain the club on the field and knit these, this inexperienced team together. But the fact that performances improved and the league places improved, and the emergence of the likes of Peter Davenport as well, showed that things were moving in the right direction.
Before we discuss the 1983-84 season, we have to discuss the John Robertson transfer saga that would more or less end the Clough-Taylor relationship. For anyone who may not know, can you discuss this situation?
Yeah, so it comes back to Peter Taylor, who'd retired in 1982 and then the following year re-emerged as manager of Derby County, who was struggling in the lower reaches of sort of the second and third divisions at this time. Taylor goes back in at Derby. He tries to probably recapture some of the magic he had at Forest. So he goes back to Forest to sign John Robertson. And the story goes that he basically didn't tell Brian Clough that was his intention. And Brian Clough only found out about this after the transfer had gone through and John Robertson had signed for Derby. So that moment was the end of Clough and Taylor's relationship and their long friendship, which had been established over 3 decades, and the partnership that they had together. All of that was kind of ended because of that one transfer. John Robertson moves to Derby, and it's just a very sad situation. And it's brought to a head even more so because in the January of 1983, the FA Cup third round, Forest are drawn away to Peter Taylor's Derby at the baseball ground, with John Robertson there with Archie Gemmell in the Derby team, and Derby turn over Forest 2-0. Archie Gemmell scores the clincher from a free kick, and it was just a sad end to what had been such a brilliant relationship. And as we know, they never patched things up in the end, and that's something that's of a great sadness, because it was just a a transfer in football at the end of the day. And, that's something that could have moved past with just one conversation.
Yeah, there was also a book that Taylor wrote, which was published at the same time, which was ghostwritten by a guy called John Sadler, who worked on the Sun newspaper, which is quite notorious in England for its, shall we say, colourful coverage of celebrities in the game. So, yeah, it was kind of a perfect storm in terms of Clough's perception of Taylor's treatment and behaviour towards him. And yeah, as Stephen says, I think the word tragedy isn't too great to describe the breakdown of that relationship and the impact that it had on both of them.
For this 1983-84 season, you have obviously the departure of John Robertson to Derby County, but also Willie Young joins Norwich, Stuart Gray joins Barnsley, Mark Proctor joins Sunderland. Later, you have Colin Todd leaving in January to Oxford. Now, as far as the arrivals, we have Dutch midfielder Frans Thijssen arriving from Ipswich Town. Though he would later during the season, he would join the North American Soccer League, joining Vancouver Whitecaps. But you also have the arrival of Paul Hart from Leeds. Also, you have Des Walker making his debut for the club during the season. Nottingham Forest are in Europe as well, and they have a very good run in the UEFA Cup, eliminating PSV Eindhoven, Celtic Glasgow along the way. They lose to Anderlecht in a very controversial semi-final. And of course, we know that subsequently, in the years later, we learned that the referee of the return leg may have been bribed. Nevertheless, it was their best run since the Champions Cup winning run. Also, in the league, they finished third, so it's improvement all around. Was there a feeling that maybe the Clough magic was back after two consecutive improving seasons?
Yeah, I think so. And the way that Forest had come back and rebuilt under Clough, and interestingly as well, without Peter Taylor by his side. So he would have been going into 82 and beyond with a real point to prove Brian Clough that, and to show that he could do this on his own, basically. He had new assistants in Ronnie Fenton. Archie Gemmill joins him later in the decade as well. Alan Hill is also a key part of his coaching staff. So all those people play a part behind the scenes. But yeah, to get Forest into Europe, first of all, to a semi-final, which arguably, they were cheated out of a final against Tottenham in the UEFA Cup. Well, there's no arguably about it. It was proven. So, and much talk around that recently as well, with Forest in the current season getting to the semi-finals of the Europa League. So there's been a lot of talk about the last time Forest were there and what happened with the bribe and Anderlecht overturning a 3-0 deficit in Brussels, having lost the first leg 2-0 in Nottingham with some questionable decisions from the referee. There was a penalty given against Kenny Swain. Well, the guy's in a completely different area of the stadium to Kenny Swain when he throws himself to the ground. There's a disallowed goal at the very end. So Anderlecht are 3-0 up. Forest in the dying seconds win a corner. It comes in. Paul Hart heads it into the back of the net. The referee, for some reason, disallows it, even though there's nobody offside. There's no fouls in the build-up to the goal. Nothing like that. So, yeah, Forest are cheated out of potentially a European trophy and a great final against Tottenham over two legs. So you throw all that together and you can see that Brian Clough had built a really good side again, because, as you mentioned, to beat PSV over two legs, considering what they go on to do later in the 80s, to beat Celtic over two legs, Celtic, particularly with the second leg at Celtic Park, that was a tricky tie. Anderlecht were the defending champions and Forest were 2-0 up against them going into the second leg of the semi-final. So this was a really good Forest team with Hans van Breukelen in goal, who was a brilliant replacement for Shilton. You had Paul Hart, who'd come in and was playing really well. Chris Fairclough was alongside him, a young player who'd come through. Ian Bowyer was captain and in the midfield, providing that key experience. Colin Walsh had filled in the John Robertson role on the left and done that very well. Up front, you had Peter Davenport, who was playing really well, scoring plenty of goals. So there was a good spine to the team, and it was a side that, in the great traditions of Clough and Forest, played some really good attacking football as well. And really strong counter-attacking stuff.
For the 1984-85 season, this is significant as it would be the last time Forest would be in Europe under Clough, of course, because of the Heysel ban. In that season, they would be eliminated in the first round by the Belgian side, Club Brugge. So that season, you have the departures of Viv Anderson to Arsenal. Ian Wallace joins French side Brest. Hans van Breukelen joins PSV Eindhoven. Then you have the arrivals of another Dutch goalkeeper, actually. Hans Seggers actually goes in the opposite direction. He comes from PSV Eindhoven. You have the Scottish defender Jim McInally from Dundee. Johnny Metgod, the Dutch star, comes from Real Madrid. You have Gary Mexon coming over from Sheffield Wednesday, but he would also leave in November, joining Newcastle. You have Franz Carr arriving from Blackburn Rovers, and the Australian defender Alan Davidson arriving from South Melbourne. Nottingham Forest would finish in the ninth place, so there's a slide. Why do you think after two improving seasons, the team did not do as well this season?
I think it came down to lack of goals more than anything else, which is an obvious thing to say. But I think that the fact that the strikers, if you look at the emergence of Nigel Clough, who was to be one of the leading goal scorers over the next few seasons, that it's significant in that the lead strikers weren't able to deliver and capitalise on that creative play that Stephen talks about.
1985-86 season is the first post-Heysel season. In any case, the club had not qualified to Europe. We have the departures of Steve Hodge to Aston Villa. Kenny Swain joins Portsmouth. Paul Hart joins Sheffield Wednesday. Alan Davidson returns to Australia, to South Melbourne. In March, we have Peter Davenport joining Manchester United. And Jim McInally also leaves in December, joins Coventry. As far as the arrivals, we have the significant arrival of Stuart Pearce from Coventry City. Neil Webb, another future star, joins from Portsmouth. Ian Butterworth joins from Coventry City. John Robertson returns from Derby County. For this 85-86 season, again, the team finished in mid-table 8th place. From a historical standpoint, it's really the significant arrival of Stuart Pearce that would make a difference in the future. But is Clough at another crossroads after two average seasons?
He is to some degree because at this point, Forest are in a team very much in transition, and I think that's shown in the league placings. I think they finish 8th this season and the season after. So so you've got new younger players being brought in, like Stuart Pearce from Coventry. Ian Butterworth joins as part of that same deal, although it doesn't quite work out for him and he eventually moves on. Neil Webb is a big signing because of what he goes on to do later in the decade. Goal scoring midfielder and quite a classy player as well with it. He comes in and just has to find his feet, and once he does, he becomes one of Forest's key players. Nigel Clough as well. He's only 21 at this point, so he's still developing his game. John Robertson, as you mentioned, comes back but never quite recaptures the magic of his first spell at Forest, and he's 32, 33 by this point, so he's nowhere near the peak of his powers, and he doesn't stick around for long either at this point. So it is a very, very much a transitional time for Forest. There's still a lot of promise, the way that the team plays, still in that great Clough tradition of trying to keep the ball on the grass, be a good passing team, but also a club like Forest, and this is still evident throughout the decade, that their best players do get picked off by the bigger clubs. So Peter Davenport there moves to Manchester United. Doesn't quite have the same impact at Old Trafford as he does at the City Ground, but he wasn't the only one to have that experience. Gary Birtles earlier in the decade, exactly the same. Manchester United pay $1 million for him from Forest, and it doesn't work out, and he eventually comes back to Forest. So, Forest have to contend with those key players getting picked off by other sides. But Clough still manages to regenerate the team and the squad and as we'll go on to talk about, some of those players that come in 1985 go on to have a really big impact on the club over the following years.
For the 1986-87 season, we have Steve Hodge joining Tottenham. Steve Wigley joined Sheffield United. Ian Butterworth joins Norwich. Colin Walsh joins Charlton Athletic. As far as the arrivals, we have in the new year the Norwegian Kjetil Oswald from Lillestrøm. We have Colin Foster also in New Year in January joining from Leyton Orient. And later in the season, Paul Wilkinson joins from Everton. This particular season, actually, Nottingham Forest started brightly. Early in the season, there was a feeling that maybe the team was getting back to its former selves. However, things leveled off thereafter, and once again, the team finished mid-table eighth again. Do you think, nevertheless, there was a hope for the future with Pierce also playing for the national team that season? And of course, Nigel Clough is starting to score goals. And of course, soon thereafter, Neil Webb would also be capped.
Yeah, Des Walker was also starting to serve notice of his potential. I think that Pierce exemplifies the element of serendipity that surrounded transfers at the time, and you can perhaps see the loss earlier in the decade of Peter Taylor affecting that magical ability to conjure up signings at the right that have instant impact or have rapid impact, because Pierce, although he's such a significant figure in the history of the club, was essentially the make weight in the deal to sign Ian Butterworth, who, as you mentioned, ended up leaving the club just a season later. So yeah, I would say that if you read about the treatment of the experience of playing for the club at that time, players like Neil Webb and Nigel Clough, obviously, are very open in the fact that they were given a very hard time by the manager. But as Pierce said in his autobiography, it made Neil Webb a footballer and an international footballer at that. So there was definitely, again, the well-recognised impact that Clough could have on a player's career. But there was awareness that Forest at the time didn't have necessarily the wherewithal to build a squad, as Stephen says, that could compete with the larger clubs that kept, and Manchester United obviously being the leading example, tempting their players away with larger crowds, greater resources. So again, it's a transitional period for the club that again are so dominated by the force of one personality.
For the 1987-88 season, we have the departures of Johnny Metcalf and Chris Fairclough. Both go to Tottenham. Gary Birtles joins Notts County along with Gary Mills. And Ian Boyer leaves again, joins Hereford United. The arrivals include Gary Parker, who joins in March from Hull City. Nigel Jemson also joins in March from Preston North End. Gary Crosby joins in mid-season from Grantham Town. And you also have the arrival of Tommy Gaynor from Doncaster Rovers. There would be a significant improvement for Nottingham Forest as this young team featuring Stuart Pearce, Des Walker, Neil Webb, and Nigel Clough. The team would finish third in the league, do well also in the FA Cup, reaching the semi-finals, losing to Liverpool, the runaway league champions that season. There's even some silverware with the centenary tournament, if anyone remembers that. Now, was there a feeling of resurgence now again?
Yeah, I think this season, finishing third and getting to the semi-finals of the FA Cup, which was a competition that Brian Clough famously struggled to reach the latter stages of. I think in his managerial career, he never got past the quarterfinals. So 1988 to get to a semi-final was a big deal for him, and it was a trophy that he really desperately wanted to get his hands on. But yes, looking at that season, to be finishing third in the league behind Liverpool and Manchester United, playing some really good football as well. This was a really good footballing side now, with Neil Webb, Nigel Clough really showing their best form. Stuart Pearce, the captain, and who was inspirational from left back. Players like Brian Rice, who went on to be cult heroes at Forest. Tommy Gaynor, as you mentioned, and a few others. This was a really, really good side that, despite being so young and inexperienced, really, really played some great football and achieved great things. And yeah, in terms of the FA Cup semi-final against Liverpool, well, Liverpool were beating everybody that season. They were just brilliant. So there was no shaming losing to Liverpool in that semi-final. And it was just, a really, really great time to be a Forest fan. There was so much to be positive about.
I think you can also see the contrast in recruitment and also in the squad between what had gone before the tempestuous, tumultuous cocktail of personalities that was the Champions Cup winning team, and the culture of recruitment that had moved on so significantly from the earlier 80s, where you had big money signings like Johnny Method and Justin Fashanu, various others that perhaps didn't work out, didn't fit the culture of the club. And players like Gary Crosby, who was such a significant figure at that time, you recruited from Grantham on the recommendation of Martin O'Neill. So you saw there Clough going back to the tried and tested method of relying on the judgment of former lieutenants, former players, as he had done previously with Peter Taylor, but building a team of nice young men, for want of a better phrase, that were, that didn't argue with referees, that were content to stay in line, not talk to the press, not create headlines. So it's an interesting contrast to, as I said, what had gone before. And you can see the maturing of Clough as almost a father figure.
During this 1987-88 season, there were reports that Brian Clough was close to being appointed as the Welsh national team manager. Can you shed more light on this?
I think with this story, I don't know if this was a bit of a ploy from Clough just to get a better deal out of Forest, really. I don't know if he was ever that interested in managing Wales. I know it was really kind of discussed heavily in the press at the time. I look back on it and wonder if that was a bit of a bargaining thing from Clough. I don't know if Jeremy agrees, but I think he struck me as a manager. If he couldn't have the England job, I don't think he was interested in international management.
Well, he wanted to do the job part-time, which wouldn't really have worked for anybody. So yes, I agree with Stephen. I think it was one of his very clever manipulations of the media. As someone that's half Welsh, I would have been very happy to see it happen, frankly, because I think obviously a team playing in red with some good players, you never know what he might have achieved. But from Forest's perspective, given that what was to happen in the next couple of years, no spoilers, I think it definitely was the right outcome. But yes, I agreed. He was very clever in the way that he manipulated the media. And I think, as Stephen says, it was principally him very cleverly playing the club to ensure that he got the treatment and the rewards that he felt he was worth.
For the 1988-89 season, Nottingham Forest tried to build on the previous season's success and once again would finish third this season. Transfer-wise, we have the departures of Kjetil Oswald, who joined Greek side PAOK. Hans Seggers, the Dutch goalkeeper, joined Wimbledon. Paul Wilkinson joined Watford, and Gary Fleming joined Manchester City. As far as the arrivals, Steve Hodge returned from Tottenham. Lee Chapman later in the season would arrive from French side Niort. Brian Laws arrived from Middlesbrough. But Nottingham Forest would win the League Cup, so there would be a trophy. They won the League Cup of defeating Luton Town in the final. This must have been their first trophy since the Champions Cup in 1980, if I'm not mistaken. But they were also present at Hillsborough on that day. And of course, in a replay of that semi-final, they would lose to Liverpool. At this point, was a third place finish, but more importantly, a trophy going with it, a significant achievement.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, to win the first trophy for the club in 9 years since that second European Cup win. Yeah, that was massive because that was the one blot on Clough's record in the remainder of the 1980s was that Forest hadn't won anything since that time. So to win this League Cup was a fantastic day out. If you ever see the footage of the game and the Forest supporters, it might not be a European Cup, but that doesn't matter because it's a great day out. It's a trophy, and it was the sign of a really good team coming together and now being able to be good enough to go on and win trophies. And obviously much has been said about the Hillsborough disaster and everything around that, but if you take that out for a moment, going into that game there was a real sense that Forest could beat Liverpool in that semi-final, having lost to them the year before, a year older, a year wiser, having won the trophy as well with the League Cup just a few weeks before. I think it might have even been the week before. So there was a real sense of optimism going into that semi-final, and obviously for very tragic reasons, things played out not how it was planned. And yeah, Liverpool in that semi-final replay, they won comfortably in the end. I think it was Forest players were just not in the right frame of mind, and I think there was no way Liverpool were not going to win that trophy after what happened at Hillsborough. So looking at it overall, though, from Forest's point of view, it was another successful season, another third-place finish, and Forest establishing themselves again as one of the top teams in the country.
We come to the end of the decade, and the 1989-90 season, we have the significant loss of Neil Webb to Manchester United. Also, others like John Sheridan would join Sheffield Wednesday, Lee Glover, Colin Foster, Lee Chapman. All those players would leave the club during the season. As far as the arrivals, we have, well, I should mention that John Sheridan had actually arrived early in the season from Leeds United, but he would depart a few months later. You also have the arrival of Icelandic Thorvaldur Orligsson, and also later in the season, Ian Wone arrived from Runcorn Halton. The team would be disappointing in the league, finishing in the 9th place, but they would once again win the League Cup, defeating Oldham Athletic in the final. So this is 2 trophies in a row, same competition. This trophy perhaps saved the season as Nottingham Forest is ending the decade.
I think so. At the time, they were that made them the most successful club in the history of the competition, albeit the League Cup only got going in the late 60s. But that was their 4th time they'd won that, 4th in the Clough era as well. And yeah, that at the time was a record and made them the most successful club in the history of the competition. So it's a real standout achievement. I think that we see another high-profile departure to Manchester United, and another one that wasn't very successful, although there were mitigating circumstances in that he picked up an injury, Neil Webb, very soon after joining United. But I think it just goes to highlight the issue and the challenge facing the club at that time, in that Webb said, well, actually, Manchester United as a team weren't any better than, in fact, they were, considerably worse off than Forest at the time. But it comes back, as he put it, to attendances. They were getting 40, 50,000 every week, and Forest couldn't get above 20 or 30. And, it's hard as a layperson to get your head around what difference 20,000 people watching you makes over an extra 20 or 30, but large, big stadiums, big crowd. I guess Webb had played for England by that stage, so was keen to showcase his talent on as large a stage and to as large an audience as possible. And therein lies the conundrum facing, a provincial club that punched above its weight.
Well, let's say we come to 1989. Neil Webb is not only in the England squad, he's a regular, he's a starter, as is Des Walker and Stuart Pearce in the post-88 Euros phase. So there's representation at the national team level as well for Nottingham Forest. As this decade ended and the new one was about to begin, was there a feeling that maybe Forest and Clough were in a stable position?
Yeah, definitely. Winning 2 trophies back to back with the League Cup, that was a great achievement. And a nice thing for Brian Clough as well, to basically do that on his own without Peter Taylor and show that he could build a team that could win trophies. Yeah, back to back third place finishers and then mid-table after that, which, was Forest finished in mid-table a few times in the 80s, so that wasn't out of the ordinary. Yeah, I think the club was in a strong position, and despite the loss of Neil Webb, there was a consistency in the team. Some really good players like Stuart Pearce, like Des Walker, Nigel Clough, all really, really good players, all internationals, and Forest were in a healthy place going into the 1990s.
And I think that the European ban was making a real difference to English football at the time, which meant with the rise of Watford and Wimbledon and the lack of exposure to more sophisticated European football, the long ball, the Route 1 culture had become much more entrenched, which meant that a team like Forest was almost a cultural institution whose style of play was an important element of the prestige in which they were held. So they came to symbolise something a bit more, I think, than just another mid-table club.
Do you think with or without Heysel ban, Nottingham Forest, it seems like in those years, in general, like the first few years of the Heysel ban, they were not a European level team, it seems like. Do you think the Heysel ban did make a difference in the end as far as the team stagnating, or maybe it wouldn't have made as much of a difference?
I think it would have made a difference to the club, particularly. It would have brought in more revenue, which would have allowed Forest to strengthen even more. And I think that team would have been well suited to European football, that team of the late 80s from sort of 87 to 91. Yeah, they were kind of robbed of an opportunity to play in Europe and test themselves against what the continent had to offer at that time. So, yeah, that was a great shame because it was a really good Forest side. And with some European experience behind them, you never know what they might have achieved. They could have won a European trophy. I think they were good enough to, or it could have strengthened them for domestic competitions. So it's one of those great questions that we'll never quite know, really. But it would have been nice to find out.
Not many of the transfers, it seems like, worked out. I mean, however, you have success stories like Pierce, of course, Walker, Webb, Hodge. They all made the England squad under Clough's tutelage, as would eventually his son Nigel and Gary Charles. How, in general, were Clough's transfer dealings viewed for this decade?
Well, I think internally, from what I've read, there was a perception that it could be slightly chaotic, in that Gary Megson is the most famous example, but there are others. I believe Danny Wilson, John Sheridan. Clough would bring players in without perhaps doing the due diligence that Peter Taylor had once done at his side, and very quickly make up his mind and that he'd done the wrong thing and moved the player on. So that created a sense of uncertainty, and all of those players that you mentioned significantly. Webb had some achievements, but most of them were very young. And again, it comes back to that point about characters that Clough could mould, not in his own image, but could mould as he wanted, rather than, say, the bigger money, bigger name signings that had egos and opinions of their own that perhaps he couldn't countenance.
So is the general consensus then that things would have been much, much different with Peter Taylor still by his side?
I'm not sure, to be honest, because when you look at where Forest were when Peter Taylor left in 1982, they were on a slide. And by his own admission, Peter Taylor felt that he'd lost his knack and that he'd let his standards slip in those years after the European Cup win. So that played a part in his retirement. So really, if you go off that, it seems like his head wasn't in the right place to carry on as Clough's assistant. Perhaps with hindsight, that was the right decision to make, because results on the pitch suggested that Forest was slipping, and that some of the signings suggested that Taylor's judgment wasn't quite how it was a few years before. So I think it probably was, on reflection, the right move for everybody involved. And yeah, we know that Taylor came back at Derby County, never hit the heights of the Clough and Taylor years at Derby of the decade before. So yeah, I think the club needed change for the 80s, and that's what we got for Forest, with Clough and a new backroom team and different players coming in. I think Forest probably did as well as they could have done in that decade, looking back.
Yeah, I very much agree, Stephen. I think that the Clough-Taylor partnership had run its course. What they achieved together was unimaginable. But yeah, there were plenty of evidence to suggest that Taylor's time had passed and that it was time to take a different approach. I think looking at the reality of his situation, of Clough's situation, of the club situation, if he had stayed, I don't think it would have worked. I don't think it would have produced a better outcome than what we got.
So, in closing, historically, how do the Forest faithful view Brian Clough's reign in this particular decade of the 1980s?
I think largely positive because despite not hitting the heights of 1979 and 1980 in the European Cups, well, really, how realistic is it that Forest are going to stay at the very top of the game? I think the natural order of football caught up to them in the end. The likes of Liverpool, Manchester United, Arsenal, all these clubs with bigger crowds, with bigger spending power, they'd eventually find their way back to the top. But saying that, Forest delivered a great European Cup, great UEFA Cup runs in the 80s. Towards the end of the decade, built a great second team, which is regarded as Clough's great second Forest side, going all the way in cup competitions, not being a million miles away from winning the league again, producing great football. Some brilliant days out for fans that are still looked on fondly to this day. Cup wins away at Arsenal and Manchester United. The two trips to Wembley in 89 and 90, winning the Simod Cup as well at Wembley on top of that, on top of those League Cups. So there were plenty of days to remember for Forest fans in the 80s and a lot of fond memories of a really good team.
And I think if you look historically, I think the key word is stability, in that, in the 70s, it was a real roller coaster of a decade. Forest went down, they came up again. Obviously, there was incredible achievements of the late 70s. But in the 90s, for a variety of reasons that we previously discussed, was another roller coaster, with Forest yo-yoing between the top division and the second tier. Whereas in the 80s, you had this throughout. Forest were an established first division team, never in danger of losing that status. And isn't it interesting that, politically in the 80s, throughout the 80s, we had Margaret Thatcher as Prime Minister, and her, political and polar opposite was in charge at Forest. So for the people of Nottingham, you had a real dichotomy. But again, that sense of stability, of certainty, running throughout the decade. So, yeah, things are slightly different now, but certainly as a Forest supporter of recent times, you look back on the 1980s and think, yeah, I'll have some of that.
Well, with that, I would like to thank both of you for your participation in this interview. All our respective contact information is listed on a blog and podcast uploads. So, Stephen and Jeremy, thank you once again and hope to continue these discussions on football history. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.